Hello everyone, this is Dr. Willow Ariella. I'm trying to get the lighting right here, but a little tricky sometimes. Anyway, wanted to share some thoughts with you from Smith&Davis Chapter 7 on conducting a good experiment, final considerations, unanticipated influences, and cross-cultural issues. So I wanted to share, go into a little bit more detail on some of their comments or chapter. So they discuss some other kinds of issues that weren't discussed in Chapter 6 that can affect results of a study. And so they talk about the types of participants. So the type and number who participate in a research study are very important considerations when researchers are figuring out how to conduct their study. They mention that it can be overwhelming, and research itself can be an overwhelming undertaking when you think about the range of participants as well as other factors that you have to consider, but just thinking about the participants and figuring out how to narrow the choices or options can be tricky. So they mentioned three things that a researcher can utilize to help narrow down the type of participant and the number of participants that you use. So they talk about precedent. So when you do a thorough literature review, you're going to see what other researchers, especially those who have conducted what are considered good studies, what other researchers have utilized for participants, the sex, the age range, and that sort of thing. So, and so you'll get a good idea of what others consider to be the appropriate or correct or accurate participant and the number of participants from doing a very thorough literature review. They also mentioned that it's noteworthy that in many of the articles using college students, the participants were drawn from a subject pool or they participated in order to receive partial credit. So they mentioned that because that can limit what in research. And the thing that it can limit is generalizability. So that's one downside of using college students among many. And they ask a good critical thinking question on page 127. Such precedents for the selection of participants have their advantages and disadvantages. What are they? So it's good to reflect on that question because there are many advantages and disadvantages. So as I mentioned, you've got a body of knowledge on a particular participant pool, which is very helpful. Sometimes, though, that can limit, as I mentioned, the generalizability of the results. And so sometimes it's very important in your literature review to see what participants have been commonly used, and then maybe you want to have a different participant pool in your study so that you can expand the generalizability, perhaps, of the results of the study. And then they talk about availability, so how easy is it to get access to the population, and that's one reason why college students are used so widely. One researcher has commented that it's very unusual to see much research done on rich people because their accessibility is difficult. So we have a lot of research conducted on poor people, interestingly enough. So it may be that we don't know very much about rich people, partly due to that. And so they talk about, availability and different types of things to consider in availability. And then they talk about what can become a circular process. You may have a large body of knowledge using a particular type of participant, and that can result in pressure to use that participant in future research projects, and so that participant continues to be used. So it may be very important to broaden the participant pool in a study so that you can see if the results are actually generalizable to other people. And then they talk about the type of research project. So quite often your study will determine the type of participant that you use. So they talk about different situations, and that was true in my research studies. The focus of my research question was on a particular group and particular ethnic group. So it was my research question determined who my participants were for valid and scientific reasons. And then they go into number of participants. The number may also be suggested by a thorough literature review. But other factors that they mention that needs to be taken into account would be finances. So how much will it cost to test each participant? Animal subjects, different area. Are you going to pay your human participants? Are you going to pay others to conduct the study on your behalf? All of those things. So, for example, in my dissertation research, I discussed with quite a few people paying the participants. I also discussed, because my participants were battered women living in shelters, I discussed with the shelter staff that issue, and it was decided not to pay them for a variety of reasons. So there are a variety of factors that can come into play in cost, but I did have to pay for printing and other materials. And I hired other women to conduct interviews with the other ethnic groups besides the Caucasian. So those are important issues. But my point is that there are drawbacks for paying participants. So those have to be factored in as well. Time, how much time is it going to take to do testing for more numbers, and availability, how easily is it going to be for you to get access to your participants. And then they discuss other factors like homogeneity and heterogeneity. So homogeneity, the more homogeneous your participants, the more they are alike, the less within group variability you should have, and the fewer participants needed. However, the more heterogeneous or different the participants, the greater the within group variability, and the more participants will be needed. So that's an important point. Sometimes you need a lot of participants because of the research question, but sometimes you don't. And so those kinds of factors, you would get into when you do a thorough literature review. You work with a mentor or an experienced researcher to determine how many participants and your participant pool. I also want to point out that in this chapter, the authors are only focusing on quantitative studies, not qualitative. So that's an important factor to consider. Qualitative studies usually have a different focus, and so the participant pool is usually less of an issue than our quantitative studies. Not always. Again, it depends on the research question and the objective of the research. But this chapter is discussing experiments, not qualitative studies. And so participant issues are different in qualitative studies. So then they ask a really good question on page 129. What is the reasoning behind these statements about variability in the number of participants to be tested in an experiment? And so they ask about reviewing nuisance variables. So they go into heterogeneity and participants, and homogeny and participants, and the variability in scores, or your variable that you're trying to test. And so they discussed this concept of power. Power, the probability that a statistical test will be significant when the hypothesis is accepted because it was assumed to be true. So power, generally speaking, the greater the number of participants, the higher the power of the statistical test. So it's to your advantage to use as many participants as possible under the constraints of your research. And statistics books have formulas and tables that assist researchers in figuring out the appropriate number of participants to achieve a level of power in your results. And so probability comes into play, and it's a factor if you want to show cause and effect especially. So again, they point out, and it's a really good point to remember, you should use your literature review as a guideline concerning the number of participants, and that you'll want to test as many participants as possible given your financial, time, and availability constraints, as well as other factors, of course. And then they talk about apparatus. So in psychological research, apparatus is typically what you're going to be using to measure. So, often it'll be questionnaires, but it could be, number of observations, or, number of behaviors that you want to record in a given time frame. So keep in mind that psychological research is much, much broader than questionnaires. Those are often done, but there are many other types of studies that are done that you would need different types of apparatus for. And so they discuss how you're going to present the independent variable, and the ways that you can do that are limited by the type of independent variable you are manipulating, by money, and by your ingenuity. So how creative can you be? Of course, sometimes that is determined by the literature review, but sometimes you might have a creative idea to test, and you should go for it and see how well it works. So they discuss some of the history of, they give an example from Skinner boxes and food delivery, and so how the IV is presented. And then they discuss DV recording, so dependent variable. How are you going to record the dependent variable? And they mentioned that recording the dependent variable is such a fundamental task that is sometimes taken for granted or overlooked by the psychologist. But there are things that need to be addressed. So they talk about presenting the IV, recording the IV. The experimenter should not become a slave to the equipment that is available. It's a very good point. So you want to consider some of the pros and cons of the ways that you're going to present the IV and record the DV. And then the authors go into the experimenter as extraneous variable. So we're talking about experimenter characteristics and how they can influence the participants. So this is a very important consideration. It was something that I had to consider when I conducted my dissertation research. And during my literature review, I discovered a smaller amount of research where it was presented that people of particular ethnic groups tend to be more comfortable and therefore would tend to be more likely to be truthful if they were being asked questions, interviewed by a person they perceived to be from their same ethnic group. So we're talking about experimenter characteristics here. I wanted to ensure that my interview results were based on the interview questions and not based on other factors as much as I could. So one of the things that I decided was because my participants were from 3 different ethnic groups: Caucasian, African American, and Hispanic or Mexican American. But I hired women. These were battered women, so I hired women from the 2 other ethnic groups to do the interviews for the 2 other ethnic groups because of that very fact, experimental characteristics. And so, so that was an important component of my research, and something that had to be considered because I wanted my interview questions to reflect the participants as honest as they could feel, comfortable in any kind of interview situation like that, and not be constrained by their perception of the interviewer. So they discussed that, psychological characteristics and physiological. So age, sex, and race can influence participant responses. I thought this Robert Rosenthal study that has shown that male experimenters are more friendly to their participants than female experimenters is interesting. I've never seen any research other than this one noted in this chapter. This is an old study from 1977, and I wonder if there have been any newer studies done on that topic. So that's very interesting to me. They ask a question: if all experiments in a study are tested by the same experimenter, then constancy is established, and this extraneous variable is controlled. If such control is exercised, why are experimental characteristics such as age, sex, and race a potential concern? So very good critical thinking question. So the authors discuss that the experimenter, it is possible that the experimenter will influence the participants in a unique manner. So different levels of friendliness, or facial expressions, or there are so many ways that experimental characteristics can influence participants. It's almost beyond comprehension, so it's pretty tricky. Problems can arise when one attempts to compare the results of similar research projects conducted by different experimenters. If these yield different results, you cannot be sure whether the differences are attributable to differences in the independent variable or to effects created by the different experimenters. So personality characteristics like hostility, anxiety, introversion, extroversion can influence the participants. Someone who is highly anxious is likely to yield different results than someone who is confident, self-assured, and experienced. So those the experimenter characteristics have to be taken into account. He is going to be interacting with the participants in any manner, and how are they going to behave. And then experimenter expectancies. So the experimenter's expectations concerning the participant's behavior can and do affect performance, affect the participants. They say the experimenter is literally a cause of the desired or expected response. So very important to note that. They ask a critical thinking question: are experimenter expectancies best categorized as extraneous variables or nuisance variables? They mention that if experimenter expectancy is operating in your experiment, you cannot tell whether your results are due to the influence of the IV, independent variable, or experimenter expectancy. So they are best labeled as confounders. They mention the Rosenthal effect and what happened in the Rosenthal study. And so experimenter expectations are often called Rosenthal effects. So again, how can the experimenter affect the results? And then how can you control for experimenter effects? So they discuss different methods. And so they talk about control techniques, but they don't simultaneously control for other physiological and psychological characteristics. At present, the most common procedures for controlling general experimental characteristics are to use standardized methods, careful training, which is what I had to consider in my research study, training the interviewers, challenging process is all I can say. It is challenging to train interviewers because they do not have the same investment in the research that the experimenter themselves does. So I don't know how, their facial expressions and all of that can still affect what happens in the interviews. But training and then standardized appearance, so standardizing things as much as possible. Replicating research also provides a good check on possible experimenter effects. And then experimenter expectancies, several things can be done to reduce or maybe eliminate experimenter expectancies. They give instructions to the experimenter gives to the participants should be carefully prepared in a consistent manner, be as objective and concrete in scoring responses, have many stories about objective and non-objective and non-concrete recording of scores or data. Some very sad stories about that. A second method for controlling experimenter expectancies, the use of instrumentation automation. So as much as possible, people like to use computers because it takes the experimenter more, it removes the experimenter more from the state. Another method is the single blind experiment. So somebody doesn't know, either the experimenter or the participant doesn't know which group they're in. And this is good if you can do a single blind or a double blind experiment. Both of those are very good methods to help reduce expectancies and experimental effects. Then they go into participant perceptions as extraneous variables. So experimenters can unintentionally influence results of an experiment, and so can the participants. So, if you're going to be participating in a study, you're going to be different. You're going to be assuming a different affect or demeanor or, attitude or whatever that is. So you're going to be a little bit different. And that's what they're talking about, is that participants want to, tend to want to do well in a study. Most people are interested in, doing their best and, not looking stupid or not behaving stupidly or, being perceived as whatever they don't want to be perceived as. And so they can be cued by things, and experimenters can be cued by participants, so there's this back and forth play that can happen. When participants use these cues to determine what the experimenter's hypothesis is and how they are supposed to act, the cues are referred to as demand characteristics of the experiment. So things that can inadvertently lead participants to respond in a particular manner. So these are participant expectancies or demand characteristics, and the desire to cooperate and act as the participants believe the experimenter wants them to is called a good participant effect. And so, so the authors go into reasons why it is appropriate to not fully disclose what a study is about. And there are some very good reasons for, I'm blanking on that word now. There are some very good reasons to not divulge the exact research question or hypothesis, because that can almost surely affect the results of the study. So they give a good example of research study on perceptions of students of rap and country music performers, and they wanted to know about race and stereotypes. And if you tell somebody that, then they're going to be looking out for race and stereotypes in their own, head while they're doing the study. And so sometimes, what's the word? It's not denial, but not fully disclosing all of your research aspects can be very important. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to get the kind of results that you're wanting. So, even though experimenters have an ethical responsibility to inform participants about the general nature of the experiment, they do not have to reveal the exact nature of the hypothesis. So that's a very important point. Depending on how the demand characteristics are perceived, they can operate either as an extraneous or a nuisance variable. Then they go into response bias. So there's people who just tend to say yes to things, or people who tend to say no to things. And then the response set, where the responses of the participants are influenced by something, whatever that is. So sometimes the experimental context or situation in which the research is being conducted can cause participants to respond in a certain manner or have a response set. So they compare that to a job interview. And then controlling for participant effects. So how do you control for demand characteristics? One way for controlling all of these things that we've been discussing is a double-blind experiment. Double-blind experiments are considered the gold standard in many types of research. And I actually think that there's too much research that isn't done in a double-blinded manner that does not give us good results. So as much as possible, people in any field of research would do well to, whenever possible, do a double-blind experiment. That way, the experimenter or the people who have been trying to conduct the interviews or whatever they're doing, and the participants do not know which group they're in. So it really can help remove many of these extraneous and nuisance variables that we're discussing. And then they talk. The authors discuss cross-cultural psychology and culture. I have an issue with the word definition culture. I think the definition. I mean, even in this text, I've seen it defined many ways. But even in this text, I think the definition of culture is so broad to be almost meaningless. But that's just my opinion. Apparently, many others do not hold that same opinion because it's discussed a lot. But if you look at the definition of culture, even in this book, lasting values, attitudes, and behaviors that are shared by a group and transmitted to subsequent generations. I mean, I don't know how you figure out which ones have been and not been transmitted. I just think culture is a very tricky concept, vague and broad. But nonetheless, we know that aspects of people who are members of different groups can affect different aspects of research. And so we have to consider that, or we ought to consider that in our research study. So they discuss some of the effects of culture on research on page 143. Your choice of the research problem, nature of experimental hypothesis, and the selection of the independent variable and the recording of the dependent variable. So, you can read more about that in the text, but they are things that have to be considered or ought to be considered, especially if someone like me who is, from a lower middle class background, Caucasian background, wants to learn more about other groups. If I did research in other groups, then I would need to know a lot more about those groups, and probably, like I did for my dissertation research, hire people to work with the participants in those groups. Because I know it can be tricky, but I want to restate the independent variable is the thing that is administered. That's the thing that we're looking for the results for. And the operational definition is how precisely is it administered and by what means. So as precisely as we can get, we want to operationally define any variable and the participants in the study. They talk about on page 144 getting a sample representative of a culture and the difficulty of that. And they discuss, the same type of participants. You cannot assume the groups were equivalent before the research was conducted. And so they go into detail about those issues. They talk about if you're going to use questionnaires in people who speak other languages, then a tried and true method in that kind of research is doing a back translation. So someone translates the interview or the questionnaire, and then someone translates it back to the original language that it was written to see if it translates correctly, accurately to that original language. And so that's what a lot of people do that's what really ought to be done to confirm that your interview or questionnaire is properly translated. So it's very important to consider that if you want to work with people who do not speak your language. And they go into items like cultural response set. And again, in my research, I had to consider these sorts of things because I was including participants who, in their culture or group, they may have a tendency to say what other people want to hear, which is another reason for hiring a perceived member of the same group to conduct the interview, so that hopefully they weren't just responding with answers that were sort of played down or not quite truthful or whatever that is. It's hard enough to talk to someone about such personal issues as being battered, so that's difficult in itself. And then talking to a stranger, getting into those details, and then being a member of another group, so all of those things are ought to be considered in a research study, especially if you're doing cross-cultural research. So some issues. So this chapter covered some issues that weren't covered in chapter 6. Again, this is an introduction. It helps prepare people for doing their own research study, but there is nothing like doing your own research study to really getting a better grasp of these different issues and topics that are being addressed in Smith&Davis. This is a very good text. It's a very good introductory text. Gives a lot of helpful information about conducting studies, but it is just the beginning. So I encourage you all to do your own study so you can get a better sense of all of these concepts that they're saying that need to be considered. Anyway, thank you for your time and attention. Sorry, only one side of my face was visible. The lighting is a little bit tricky here, but still, we got to talk a little bit about the importance of different aspects of research. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and see you later.